Hello and welcome along. So, the Ultramarine, what can we tell you about the early days of the Ultramarines? Well, I think to start off with, what's quite interesting about the Ultramarines is they were recruited in a different way to many of the other legions. So often the legions are recruited from specific populations on Old Terra, and that population often passes on quite a lot of their cultural baggage onto the legion, and you get that kind of shapes the early flavor of the Legion. With the Ultramarines, they now that kind of happens, but in a different way. So they don't recruit from a very specific population. They recruit from a very specific type of person. So they recruited essentially solely from the last most difficult holdout groups. So these were the populations from around Terra that basically, at the end of the Unification Wars, had been kind of holding on with their fingernails and not giving in to the Imperium, and needed to be utterly smashed to get them to be incorporated into the Imperium, or at least what was left of them. And what was left of them often was nothing more than some orphans, basically, refugees, orphans. So these were the most difficult, independent-minded populations on Old Terra. The people who could not see the writing on the wall and would just simply refused to give in and become part of the Imperium. And so you can imagine these populations, if left to their own devices, would always be the difficult people, the ones that the Imperium was constantly having to watch for, new rebellions coming about later on, counter revolutions, this kind of thing. And so the solution to this was to recruit these remnants of these populations into the legions, and in this case, so to the Ultramarines. Now, why the Ultramarines? Because the Ultramarines had a very powerful quirk in their gene seed. Well, it's not really a quirk because it's entirely intentionally there. One of the main reasons the Guilliman exists, essentially, the way that the Emperor created him and therefore his gene seed, is that it's very powerful at making people compliant, essentially. It turns you into the ultimate team player. You have a very high ability to cooperate with others, to fit into a hierarchy, take orders, and to complete tasks. They described as having an almost pathological need to complete tasks. So you get basically the ultimate cog in the machine. So if you're trying to recruit a team, trying to build a team, you want people who are going to work well together, we're going to take your orders, and they're going to feel almost compelled to carry out the tasks you give them. And this is what an Ultramarine is, basically. And they're like that, partly because of training and indoctrination, but underlying that is this incredible power of Guilliman's gene seed to turn the most difficult, belligerent, independent-minded person into the ultimate team player. And that's what the Emperor wanted, and it worked perfectly to get control and over these very difficult populations and not waste them. Because obviously, he could, at this point, he had overwhelming power. By this point, he could have just exterminated them, but he doesn't like to waste human resources. So he thinks, well, these would be great recruits if only they could be turned, mentally to being the type of person that we want in the Imperium, and not the pains in the asses that they would otherwise be. So that's the power of the gene seed goes to work and turns these what otherwise would be constant rebels into the near perfect citizen. So so the Ultramarines recruit from these populations, and that it gets them this name, the Warborn, which from the kind of other Imperial forces, basically because all of their recruits are coming from these orphans, these war orphans, who the last survivors of these populations who've been nearly wiped out to get them to come into compliance with the Imperium. Now, as the campaign goes on, they move out into the solar system. The Ultramarines, or they're not called the Ultramarines at this point, I should say. They only are named the Ultramarines when they join up with Guilliman. Like many of the legions, they don't take on an official name until they are reunited with their Primarchs. So they were just known as the 13th, although they did take this nickname of the Warborn because of, as I said, because of the way they're recruited. So they go out into the solar system. They take part in the pacification of Luna, so that's the moon. They then go in to take part in the Sedna campaign, which is a kind of the last major campaign of the reuniting the solar system. So it was a group of aliens unknown aliens, still don't know who they are, living out on the edge of the solar system in a kind of an artificial planet, and they were controlling, well, attacking and like dominating the outer parts of the solar system. And the Emperor took 8 legions out and destroyed them in some way. Again, a bit of a mystery. There's no real details of the campaign, but the Ultramarines were involved in that. They then continued out into the early parts of the Great Crusade as the nearby systems were starting to be taken back under control, and they did very well. They have quite a long list actually for compared to most legions of just planets that they took control in, battles they fought in and won, which is actually one of another main differences I think I found with the Ultramarines compared to the other legions is there's more about them, there's more recorded. And you could say this is just because there's more written about them in the game lore, because they're a bigger chapter. People are more popular chapter, so it makes sense to write about them more. But in the Imperial, so from a context of in universe, it's essentially because they were more acceptable public face of the campaign, so that the methods they used were more acceptable. They just had a better image in that sense, and you trying to convince people that you're doing the right thing, you don't want to be sending back images of the Dark Angels like purging a population with rad bombs, or the World Eaters ripping people to pieces with chain axes, the Night Lords skinning people alive. These aren't good publicity images. So the kind of more balanced and ethical methods of war that the Ultramarines were using is much more of a good image to send back to the general populace. So it makes more sense that their battles, their campaigns would survive in Imperial records, because the others just wouldn't be recorded, basically, and any recording, they would be kind of suppressed. So that also works in universe as well as the kind of the more meta idea of why they're more information about the Ultramarines. Now, as the Crusade continued, they got further and further out. Their numbers were building up. Now, the Ultramarines were very good at building up their numbers as well. So they were able to recruit more than most of the other legions because their gene seed was particularly stable. So when Astartes are recruited, basically they need gene seed. The gene seed comes from other Marines, basically. It's implanted into them, it grows in them, and then it's taken out and implanted into the recruit, who then eventually becomes a full-grown Astarte himself, who then gets his own implanted gene seed. So it's called the progenoid gland, and basically it's a new set of gene seed growing within the Astarte. And the trouble is, though, it has a tendency to mutate each generation. So you might start off with the original gene seed that's been put into the first number of round of recruits being okay, but then the next round's a little bit mutated, and the next round is a little bit mutated. So it's that idea of photocopying photocopies, and it always breaks down eventually. And so some of the legions had big problems with this, and they were really struggling. And often you need like a re-injection of pure gene seed from the Primarch, and so until you find your Primarch, it's hard to get that. Or that there are vaults of this stuff held in Terra and on Luna where you can go back and get that initial gene seed and try and use that. And that was also a solution. But again, there's a limited amount of this. And ideally, you want to just keep recruiting from the implanted gene seed in your other Astartes and just keep going up like this. And because the gene seed of Guilliman is very stable, the Ultramarines were able to keep this going and just recruit much more quickly than a lot of the other legions. So they did build up the numbers pretty quickly. And this eventually led to them being given their own expeditionary fleet. There wasn't just that. It was because, one, they had the numbers, but yes, it was also because they were very successful, and they also showed themselves to be like responsible, trustworthy, whereas some of the other legions you might remember from if you've watched any of my other videos on early legion history, they needed a little bit more of a guiding hand. The Ultramarines could be let loose and to make good decisions on their own. And they also were given, obviously, responsibility over other elements within that expeditionary fleet. So Imperial Army units, naval units, and various auxiliary forces. Now, some of those auxiliary units might be quite difficult, quite untrained, or maybe even undisciplined, even some with mixed loyalties because they might have recently been incorporated into the Imperium. And the Ultramarines also took on a role where they would have small detachments, basically go and function almost kind of like a military police within these other units, enforce discipline on them, and sometimes inspire them to great deeds, but essentially they were acting like the chaplains that would later come into the Astartes. They were kind of just that focal point of discipline and inspiring, great acts of courage and things like that. This was a role that they really solely took on. None of the other legions really did that, and that's mainly because the other legions didn't like the idea of it. They thought it was beneath a legionary to do that, but the Ultramarines thought this was perfectly good use of their time. Now, of course, they were also doing all the other things that the legions were doing. They were a large legion, as I said, so they could take part in these large legionary operations. So it wasn't just these detached small groups that were going off and doing these special tasks. Now, this leads us to a point where the Legion had grown to around, I think, something like over 30,000 individuals. They had, as I said, their own fleet, and they were one of the few of the legions that had their own fleet at this stage. Now, at this time, the Ultramarines were commanded by Lord Commander Gren Vosotho. Now, he seems to have been a very capable leader, a classic Ultramarines officer in that sense, very good at all the parts of being a commander of a legion. He doesn't really have any flaws. He's doing a great job. He's got this history of winning many campaigns, and he's been trusted with leading this expeditionary fleet. I think it was the 12th expeditionary fleet, although technically not the 12th in number, but it was named the 12th. I think at this time it was actually one of few actual expeditionary fleets of any size. There were probably a few minor ones that gave you that built up to the number, giving the number 12. But in terms of major expeditionary fleets, there were only I think three or four others at this time. So it was quite an honour for them to get this command of their own fleet. However, it's fair to say that although the Ultramarines were doing a great job and were trusted by the Imperium, by the Emperor, etc., and admired by many of the other high-ranking members of the Imperium, they did have a slight hint of a flaw in them, which was this feeling of slightly jealousy of the legions that did have their own Primarchs back, reunited with them. And so they may have led to them trying a bit too hard to prove how good they were, and they had a tendency to strike up rivalries with other legions, not with any underhand tactics or anything, but maybe just trying a little bit too hard to prove they were just as good or maybe even better, because they felt slightly, maybe it is a strong word, but inadequate, because they didn't have their Primarch with them, or more like they just didn't feel complete, like there was something missing, and that led them to try a little bit too hard. That's at least kind of hinted at. Now, around this time, there was a large rebellion in the Cyrus cluster. So this was an area of human-populated world which had been brought into the Imperium. Word started getting out that it had gone into rebellion. So a few ships that had been attacked in the area, and there were just reports that things weren't going quite right, and they didn't really know what was happening, but something was going wrong. And so the Ultramarines were nearby, and they were sent to take care of this. So Lord Commander Gren Vosotho, Vosotho, was tasked with bringing these worlds back into compliance. Well, first of all, find out what's going on, and then sort it out. Now, he was trusted to make the right decisions, to go and sort it out himself. So he does. So he sets off with the Legion, arrives at the area. Now he thinks, well, okay, this is just one of those situations where the human population has decided that they can rebel against the Imperium, because maybe the larger forces of the Imperium have moved on and they've just left with a small garrison and so on, and they've decided to chance their arm at a rebellion and see what happens. So he develops a plan to bring them back into compliance, and it's based on a very tried and tested method of basically decapitating the snake. So basically you go down and you target the leadership, you eliminate them, and the general population comes back on side quickly. Because usually it's the leadership of these worlds that are actually the problem, not the general population. And if you just show the people that you can hit really hard and fast, kill these people that cause the problem, and then everyone else will just go, whoa, okay, this is serious now. We're fine. We're going to fall back in line. So he develops this plan, and he puts this into action. They mount a landing on the kind of main world of this group of star systems, and they attempt the plan. But what they find is that the population aren't they're no longer normal humans. They're humans, but they're kind of zombified, like under the mind control of something. They don't really know what. And the human population just comes at them in waves and waves and waves. And this is completely different to what they expected. They expected to be fighting a very small group of the leadership and their guards. Instead, they're fighting the entire population, who are not acting like normal humans would, and they're not running away, because normally people see Space Marines and they run, or they just stand there terrified, shitting their pants. Basically, this is not a normal reaction. So these people are coming at them in waves, just throwing themselves at them with no fear, no sign of normal human emotions. And they just get bogged down in the sheer weight of bodies, and just keeps coming. And being a proud military man, he doesn't want to retreat. So he decides, well, we just got to press on, and he keeps trying to press on, attacking them. And he kind of wades his way with his troops through this human wave, and he starts to make his way towards where the leadership would be. And as he progresses, the adversaries sort of get better armed, but they're essentially the same. They're like these sort of glazed over, I'm going to say they're zombie-like, but not actual zombies. They just aren't thinking. They're just doing, just attacking, and in waves and waves. And then he gets word from the fleet that some ships have appeared literally out of the sun. And these are ships, are completely unidentified ships. So they're alien vessels, and they're massive, and they start to attack the Ultramarines fleet in orbit. And so he realizes now that these humans, it isn't just normal human rebellion. Obviously, he's realized that when he sees these humans behaving weirdly, but it's not even like a human psyker or something controlling them. He realizes now that the Xenos are involved, the filthy Xeno filth. And he decides that things are not what I expected, and he has to try and get his forces off of the planet. But at the same time, the fleet is getting battered by this alien fleet. And eventually the fleet is getting to the point where it's got to retreat. So it's lost a lot of ships. It has made some minor damage to the enemy, but they're clearly outclassed, and they aren't going to be able to last long. So the fleet manages to heroically last for just long enough for the Ultramarines on the ground, to whoever survived, get to their gunships and get back off of the planet, get back on the ships, and then they all skedaddle out of the system back to safer Imperial space. And this is obviously a massive defeat for the Legion. This is probably the first time they've been defeated, in fact. And not only is it the first time, it's just a huge defeat. So they've taken something like a fifth of the Legion dies, something like 6,000 legionaries. They lose a quarter of their fleet. So that's a huge number of battleships, etc., cruisers that they've been entrusted with. And so it's quite embarrassing for them, and it leaves a deep scar on them, their personality of the Legion. And eventually they will go back. So about a year later, they manage to recuperate enough and go back with some special support troops, some anti-psyker troops and things like this. Probably Son and Sisters, but not actually sure. And they go back and they find the system is empty. So basically these aliens have disappeared. Now, I don't know if those aliens are ever found or again in the future, because I didn't find any information about that. But this leaves the Ultramarines really with kind of this feeling of, not only did they get defeated, their plan didn't work. So that's embarrassing. They then had to retreat. That's terrible, because Space Marines almost never need to retreat. And they'd lost so many that's a huge scar on them, a huge mental scar. But now they can't even redeem themselves by going back and defeating this enemy. Now they're actually forewarned that they're there. So they carry this around for quite a while, and they never really get over this kind of scar, mental scar, until they get reunited with Gilliman. And so fortunately for them, it doesn't take a huge amount of time for that to happen. I think it's something like 5 years or something after this point that they're reunited with Gilliman. So it turns out that the Emperor had already found Gilliman slightly before this battle took place, but he was unable to get to Gilliman because of the warp. The warp does strange things. He was unable to. That's a different story of how he actually finds Gilliman, but he knew Gilliman was there, but he couldn't quite get to Macragge to meet him. So it took him another 5 years to get there. And during that time, the Legion was kind of moping about a bit and kind of like, well, feeling sorry for itself, feeling like it was embarrassed. It was kind of lost its way a little bit and needed some direction. So, but being Ultramarines, they didn't do anything wrong. They didn't go off and like murder loads of civilians like some other legions might. They didn't. They didn't stop doing their job. They kept on doing it, but they just didn't feel as good about it as they had before. Now, I should also say during this campaign that the Lord Commander Gren Vasotho actually dies in the campaign, getting the troops off of the planet, so he's no longer around. So, in some ways, that also added to the scar of the mental scar for the Ultramarines because they lost their command at the same time, but also it kind of gave a bit of a clean break of the old ways to the new ways that would happen under Guilliman. So I think it's Marius Gage takes over as the new Lord Commander. He then leads the Legion into the time where they come into contact with Guilliman. So during this time, in the gap between this terrible defeat and finding the Primarch again, Marius Gage would lead them very successfully, and they would fight with almost a desperate need to prove themselves, which led them to doing still doing very good things. It's just that they didn't have this kind of feeling of satisfaction that they had before when they were fighting before the defeat, and they kind of had this greatly increased their longing for their Primarch to be reunited with their Primarch, to feel whole. This was the kind of main feeling, and of course eventually they are reunited with Guilliman. So not that long after this, as I said, probably about a 5-year gap, they do get reunited with Guilliman. And so now Guilliman does change the Legion a fair bit, like the Primarchs tend to do when they get reunited with their legions, but he didn't change the kind of really the character of the Legion much. Him being reunited with him did kind of heal the wounds of this failed campaign, but it didn't really change some huge amount after that. What he did is he incorporated some of the ideas he developed on Macragge into the Legion, and mostly it was more about improving recruitment and logistics and really building the infrastructure around the Legion to make it even more good at what it already was good at doing in terms of recruiting quickly, being organized, adaptable, taking on new tactics, and so on. So much of the character of Guilliman is obviously in this gene seed, and that's incorporated into the Legion already. He basically magnifies what they're already good at. He makes them even better at, and he then does give them the name Ultramarines, which comes from an ancient symbol of Ultramar that exists on Macragge, and they get the blue livery. That is the story of the Ultramarines. What are the Ultramarines? They're probably one of the most effective legions, just simply because they have none of the extremes of the other legions, so they do well in most circumstances. As we know, they're very good at the kind of the non-fighting parts of war as well, the bits that actually matter more in many ways, which is the logistics, the organization, the training, the recruitment, all of this stuff that allows you to fight a war well. They do really well, probably better than almost all the other legions, and that's why they have large numbers. That's why they can recover from big defeats. They obviously went on to have an even worse defeat at the beginning of the heresy at Calth, which was the worst defeat that any legions has suffered in terms of numbers lost. But they recovered from that as well. And then even so, by the end of the heresy, they're back up to being the biggest legion. So they're just very good at absorbing casualties, absorbing disasters, and they don't already have that many disasters. But when they do, they can recover quickly. And this is all part of their character. It's all part of what they are and what Guilliman is. He's the ultimate organizer, basically. And the Ultramarines are the ultimate team players. So when you've got a great organizer and a great team, you usually get great results. So there you go. So let me know what you think in the comments. Is there anything here you learned new about the Ultramarines? There's a fair few things I didn't know about them before looking into this. And I thought their history was more interesting than I thought it was going to be, to be honest. I specifically didn't know about this power of the gene seed to really change the most difficult recruits into the textbook soldier, which is quite interesting, and how they recruited during these early stages specifically from these very belligerent, difficult, independent groups, which helped helped the Empire become more stable and stop rebellions growing up behind them as they move forward. I also didn't know about the the Osiris Cluster Rebellion. I never heard of that at all. So, a huge defeat for the Legion that really scarred them and kind of like, in many ways, foreshadows Calth. So interesting, I thought. Anyway, there you go. So thanks a lot for watching. Please subscribe, like, share, all those things, and I will see you next time.